Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity to talk a little bit about this topic that I'm really passionate about as well. I'm here talking to you as a clinician scientist. In my day-to-day practice, I see people before, during, and after pregnancy who have chronic medical conditions or new conditions during pregnancy. So a lot of times I'll be counseling pregnant patients or people, looking to become pregnant about how to manage their underlying conditions, and that involves a lot of medications that they're currently using. So this is part of my day-to-day practice. I'm also talking to you here as a person with lived experience of pregnancy and current living experience of pregnancy. So if I do sound short of breath, it's because I am short of breath. Yes, so I will start with a land acknowledgement. We're here in Vancouver, but I acknowledge that the land where I live and conduct my work, Tiohtià:ke, is the traditional and unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, and it's a place that has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst nations, and that continues to carry this tradition of cultural mixity forward. And it's particularly important, I think, for our work to recognize the structural determinants of health that we are dealing with in healthcare and in healthcare research, and to continue to honor and recognize the Indigenous ways of knowing as they refer to reproductive health. So at the end of this session, you will hopefully all be able to reflect on lessons learned during the COVID-19 pandemic about inclusion of pregnant patients in clinical trials, identify perceived barriers and facilitators to the inclusion of pregnant people in clinical trials, and anticipate some of the practical aspects related to the inclusion of this population in clinical trials. So we'll start with a case study that you will all perhaps be familiar with. We're in December 2025, and the World Health Organization has declared a pandemic of influenza H7N9. And we suspect that this disease might be more severe and affect pregnant individuals differently. And as a person with an interest in clinical trials in pregnancy, you have been asked to join as a co-investigator on a multi-center trial that will be investigating the use of oseltamivir to reduce severe pulmonary disease. The trial's steering committee is reflecting on methods to support the inclusion of pregnant individuals in this trial. And so you're wondering how we should go about including pregnant participants going forward. So what we've learned, and as you've heard from the talk earlier, during the COVID-19 pandemic, despite more severe outcomes in pregnant individuals, and despite everything that we know about the absolute need and moral imperative to include pregnant and lactating people in clinical trials, most trials, at least early in the pandemic, did not include pregnant individuals and specifically excluded them. And importantly, these were trials that were sometimes looking at drugs that already had a track record of safety and efficacy in pregnancy that could have been part of consent procedures and could have been used to inform eligible and potential research participants. And that includes chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine, which has long been used for the treatment of arthritis, lopinavir and ritonavir that has been used for the treatment of HIV for many, many years, and convalescent plasma studies. And we know that these products can be administered safely in pregnancy. So we're not talking about funky phase 1 and 2 new novel trials. We're talking about bread and butter medications that are used in pregnancy. What we've also learned is that despite the fact that they were actively being excluded from clinical trials, they were also given investigational drugs outside of the purview of the clinical trial. So that includes drugs that were later on found to be associated with severe adverse events, including arrhythmias, allergic reactions, etc. So they were given these medications sometimes as an end, a third-line medication, but really in the absence of any evidence for using these medications. And we really have proof that these were being given in the United States, including, in places where there's a very high litigious potential. So they're excluded from trials, yet we still gave them the medicine without all the monitoring that a trial infrastructure would provide. And that is very problematic. Eventually, though, we learned And some trials did change their inclusion criteria, and many allowed for pregnant individuals to be eligible and to be included in clinical trials, including trials that were investigating the use of remdesivir, convalescent plasma, and anticoagulants. And I'm just showing you here a picture of our management order sets or our clinical guidelines at the hospital where I worked, where as part of routine clinical care, trial participation was offered for all patients admitted with COVID-19, including those who were pregnant. So there was an evolution throughout the pandemic of how we were approaching this topic. So what we were interested in early on in the pandemic is understanding what are some of the physician perspectives on the inclusion of pregnant people in COVID-19 clinical trials. And the reason why we surveyed physicians specifically, while there are many other stakeholder groups that should be surveyed about this, is because physicians belong to a professional group with the potential to really shape the inclusion of pregnant people in clinical trials because of so many investigator-initiated trials that are important in this area and that oftentimes will be led by clinician scientists that are physicians. Physicians' opinion as well may affect the motivation to design such research, and pregnant people may look up to their physician for guidance about participating in clinical trials. So this is really a first step. We really surveyed a small portion of the population of stakeholders, and there are limitations to that. But given that, we developed an online questionnaire with a multidisciplinary team. We assessed the perspectives of physicians that were surveyed on the appropriateness of inclusion and the urgency of including pregnant individuals in COVID-19 trials, their level of comfort with such enrollment, and some of the barriers to inclusion. The survey was pilot tested among 10 physicians from different specialties, and it was disseminated across professional societies, including the Society of Obstetricians and Gynecologists of Canada, which was facilitated at the time and still is being facilitated by Jocelyn Cook, who might be in the audience here, the Canadian Society of Internal Medicine, and the Association of Medical Microbiology and Infectious Diseases of Canada, as well as the Canadian Critical Care Society. So these were felt to be physicians who were likely to interact with patients who may be critically ill with COVID-19 or at least hospitalized with COVID-19 and to be pregnant. And so we had 168 respondents, so quite a good snapshot of our population of physicians. Mostly, we had responses from obstetricians and gynecologists and maternal fetal medicine specialists, but we also captured the opinions of people in family medicine, infectious diseases, critical care, as well as obstetric medicine and general internal medicine. People were working in academic centers in majority, but also in community hospital setting, as well as primary clinics and outpatient setting. And while some were, had a portion of their practice dedicated to research ranging from 25 to 75% of research protected time, most of our respondents were people who in fact did not have protected time for research, so who really represent the bread and butter of clinicians who may come across inclusion criteria for a clinical trial. And what we found is that most respondents really supported the inclusion of pregnant people in clinical trials. That included that they found that it was appropriate for them to be included, especially if there was a safety track record of the medication in pregnancy. And actually, a lot considered that it was critically urgent or highly urgent to, provide this inclusion going forward, and that they were more or less comfortable with doing so. When we looked at the answers of those few who did mention not being comfortable, finding it non-urgent or inappropriate, we found several expressions of reluctance. And this is really important because, as you know, these are some of the barriers and the issues that really will need to be addressed in priority in order to be ready in 2025, 2026, when the next one happens. And so these are not surprising responses, but potential harms to the fetus, adverse effects on the mother, perception of low risk, so communication surrounding the risk of the disease in pregnant individuals is particularly important, also for trial concerns. The lack of demonstrated efficacy, which when we have clinical equipoise, this is very common to not know whether the drug is going to be working or not. The culture of non-prescription, so we're really talking about a broad culture change, the lack of experience with the medication, and the lack of understanding of the natural history of the disease. So these were expressions of reluctance and barriers that were specifically identified were the perceived unwillingness of other team members or the perceived unwillingness of pregnant individuals to participate in clinical trials. But for those of us who have worked in partnership with pregnant individuals who do clinical research, I really want to emphasize that this is a perceived unwillingness, because a lot of time there will be an overwhelming willingness to contribute to research and to participate and to join as active members in research. So this is, again, a bit of a miscommunication between what is being perceived in the physician community that answered the survey and what is actually going on in real life. Many highlighted the burden of regulatory approvals, where even though the researchers themselves were really interested in conducting trial that included pregnant individuals, their REBs and Health Canada was actually the ones blocking the process. So one may ask, who's being protected if really, patients would like to participate and would be protected from some harm by participating, and researchers are willing to go the extra mile, and the REBs and Health Canada are protecting. We can just have an interrogation there. And again, the burden of recruitment and the lack of eligibility of participants were some of those barriers that could be addressed going forward, and liability concerns as well. Finally, the lack of infrastructure, where the individual physicians were thought to be very alone when facing the potential for recruiting pregnant participants. So our take-home messages from this survey was that, of course, there's a need for increased continued education about the potential benefits and to really highlight the importance of self-determination for potential pregnant participants, and to facilitate this inclusion, the barriers that have been identified really need to be addressed. So at this stage, what do we need and how can we still walk the walk to include pregnant participants in non-obstetric clinical trials? And what I mean by non-obstetric clinical trial here is a trial that is not primarily designed to answer a question about pregnancy, but a design that is currently enrolling adult participants for other reasons, and that we want to make sure that this trial does not leave pregnant individuals behind. And I'll walk you through a practical example of our SNAP trial, which is a trial looking at different interventions for the treatment of Staph aureus bacteremia. And the reason why we wanted to write this piece was because of the challenges in conducting clinical trials, and we wanted to be able to share our lessons learned by our group by adapting such a protocol in order to potentially help other teams do the same with their own trial. So the first step was really about our team, building an interdisciplinary working groups that will include persons with lived experience of pregnancy to really be able to capture what are going to be the complexities of designing the pregnancy-specific arm of the trial. And so it's important to work in an interdisciplinary fashion with people who can understand both the trial content and the diseases being studied in the trial, as well as the whole pregnancy piece, so we can all come together and strategize. We also want to be early on identifying an independent pregnancy-specific drug safety and monitoring board, so that in case there are some adverse events, we can really look at them with a lens of people who understand both worlds. For eligibility, we want to define eligibility criteria for the pregnancy arm, be it self-report or the result of a test that may support that the patient is actually pregnant, and include pregnancy-specific information about the intervention within the usual consent procedures. So for instance, when we were doing the SNAP trial, we really included data specific to the medications that were being studied as they related to pregnancy and what would need to be known at the moment of consenting from a pregnancy perspective, but it was just like an adjunct to the usual consent procedures. Then for the dosing, we heard that dosing is important in the NICU. Dosing is really important everywhere, especially when taking into consideration physiologic changes of pregnancy. You want to make sure that your intervention, if it's a pharmacological intervention, is really adapted to pregnancy specifically. And importantly, decide on some of the trial endpoints that may be specifically pertinent for pregnancy-specific research. So that includes actual pregnancy outcomes, safety outcomes that may be particularly important for pregnancy that are different from the other trial outcomes. So for instance, because of the increased prothrombotic risk in pregnancy, we are really interested in capturing the number of thrombotic complications associated with some of the medications that are being given intravenously for the SNAP trial specifically, as well as neonatal outcomes. And all this needs to be done in balancing the added burden of data collection. So we want to know more, but we also want to make sure that everything that we are going to be asking in terms of additional information will really be relevant and will inform clinical practice. So that has been our proposed approach for the trial that we adopted for the inclusion of pregnant individuals. Of course, each of these points need to be adapted for individual trials, but that gives us a general framework of how this can be done, and this has been done. We did adapt the trial to include pregnant individuals. 5 countries are now recruiting pregnant individuals, and we do have some that have consented to participate, and we have, as part of this SNAP trial now, data that is going to be specifically collected for pregnant individuals. So the take-home message is that study protocols of non-obstetric trials can be successfully adapted to accommodate pregnant participants. It can be done and it should be done. We should always have an assumption of eligibility instead of a culture of exclusion going forward. And when December 2025 arrives, we need to be extending our learnings from the pandemic to non-COVID-19 trials. We need to offer participation in non-obstetric clinical trials, and particularly in trials that are going to be addressing severe and potentially life-threatening condition. There really is a moral imperative there, and that with careful and diligent planning by a multidisciplinary team really dedicated to considering pregnancy-specific complexities, this really can be done. So I thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.